As you might have seen from some promotional material, the Blender UI I'll be using during this course is slightly different than the default. And really, it's down to a few personal preferences, but also a few practical considerations as well. I use a lot of modifiers, so I like to have a lot of space in my startup file to use modifiers and not be cramped by what's going on the screen. So with the very fresh sort of install of Blender, I'm using version 2.83. This is currently the beta, so this splash screen might look a little bit different for you, but it's down to the same idea. I want to kind of clean up this scene and kind of make it as minimalistic as possible. And we're going to do that in two parts. First, we're going to customize our startup files, and secondarily, we're going to look at the preferences. So let's start with that. First of all, I'm going to leave all of this default. I'm going to select with left and use play for the spacebar, and let's leave on the dark theme as well as using the Blender shortcuts. So I'm going to hit Save New Settings initially and just click away the splash screen. So by default, I have a couple of things that I like to do, such as, let's take away the timeline here. Let's grab all this stuff and make this a little bit larger. So I'm going to delete all of these extra workspaces because I know the shortcuts for the different panels of Blender. So I like switching between the panels and making my own panels here. And let's call this default. And now we know we've customized this. Now, I was very quick there, but I basically just dragged the corners of each. And if you drag these out, you'll create a new panel. But if you drag them in over on top of another panel, you'll actually drag these out. So let's do this, and let's do this twice. So the way I like setting things up over here is to have all of my properties here. And the reason for that is we're using a whole bunch of modifiers. And I'm just going to add, if we have a bevel and then maybe wireframe or whatever, you can see this starts filling up quite quickly. And I like to have the full sort of height of my screen to have enough information there so I can quickly switch between different modifiers and have a few of them open all at once. Now I'm going to do this something similar here where I've got my outliner. And in this case, if we're working with a lot of modifiers, so let's see if we throw on a subdivision surface here, for example. I'm not creating any art or anything, but I just want to show you in the outliner, if you hit the plus key on your numpad, you actually open up and show all these modifiers. And this is really nice to have these two columns to have a lot of vertical space to work either with a lot of objects or with a lot of modifiers. So again, yeah, let's just leave it at that for now and set up a couple of defaults that look good. So let's start with render settings with Eevee. Let's set up Eevee, and I'm going to leave these samples to the default, set up ambient occlusion, turn on bloom, turn on my screen space reflections, and we'll talk about optimizing these at a later date, and just have enough going on here. I like to move up the color management here as well, so I can easily switch between different looks, for example. So I like a slightly more contrasty look by default, so I can set that up. And that's pretty much it for now. I'm not going to worry about that too much. For example, you could set your default settings for saving. So generally, I'll set these to JPEG, especially when I'm doing animations. If I set this to 1 and maybe 300 rather, and a frame rate of 30. Now I've got 10 seconds and I set this to the default. This is, I'm using Linux, so this is the default sort of temporary directory. You could set up any directory you want. That way I know when I do test renders, they're going to be JPEGs and they're going to be fairly quick to save and I know exactly where they are. Again, this is all just down to personal preference. So it's up to you what you prefer. But yeah, I just like to set a few of these things up. Passes, I don't really enable any particular one by default. But what I will do is turn off gravity. If I do any simulations, they're not immediately affected by gravity. I need to turn it on myself. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in like the particle settings, particle and cloth simulation stuff when we get to it. And same with the units. In general, so let's open up our side panel here. Everything is set to meters. In general, what I'll do is just set the unit system to none. Because I know these are meters anyway, I don't need the extra indication there. Unless I want to do something very specific with the units, I like to turn this off so that it's just values and I'm not really confusing myself with anything else or cluttering up the UI with anything else. And you'll see this as we're setting this up in the preferences, that it's all about just taking away extra stuff in your UI to kind of keep your workplace focused. And yeah, that's about it. I'll generally turn down the surface of the world. So if you just set this to rendered very quickly, if we set this to black, it basically means outside of the light, if I turn this off, we're not actually going to get any lighting in our scene. So anything that we add, we know we're starting from scratch and we're not getting any influence from anything in the background. And that's roughly it. Yeah, so I'm going to adjust these a little bit and just move on to the outliner from here. Now, by default, if I go back to solid mode here, what's going on in the outliner is that we only have the toggles for hiding in the viewport enabled, and I don't really use those an awful lot. So generally what I'll do is actually turn those off and turn on the toggles for being able to select stuff in the viewport and then seeing it in the viewport. This is a different viewport enabler. So this is just hiding it in the viewport, and this is altogether disabling it in the viewport. And especially if you're using a lot of modifiers, you might prefer to use disable rather than hide, because it's not actually going to take into account a lot of those modifiers. It's going to turn a lot of that computation off, which is nice. And then disable in renders as well. So with those set up, I've got a bit more control, and also I can turn on and off modifiers here in the expanded view if I want to. And that's kind of what I wanted to show you, what I was doing earlier. And yeah, it's good to know. Now we can easily turn on and off modifiers in our viewport if we want to, which is quite nice. We don't always have to go to the modifier panel and start clicking away. And you'll see, especially in some of the more advanced examples, we might have 5 or 6 or 7 or maybe even up to 10 modifiers. And it's real easy just to be able to click and drag these and turn them off. Another thing I'm going to do is just hit T in the viewport to hide that panel over there, and hit N in the viewport to hide that panel on the right. But before I actually do that, I want to change one more thing, and I want to actually change the focal length of my viewport. I like this just a little bit better. Back in the day in Blender 2.7, this was set to 35, which meant you had quite a bit of distortion. Now it's set to 50. I don't know why, it's just a personal thing. I like setting this to 70 millimeters as it gives you somewhere between an isometric and a perspective view, and I just get a better feel for the scene in general. Now again, this is all purely personal. You know, you don't have to do that if you don't want to. So I think that's about it. Everything else I do is just deleting everything that's in the starting scene, and maybe even delete this collection as well, just so I have a very clean starting point for my scene. And keep in mind as well that even your viewport rotation is going to be set. So our y-axis is actually going to point towards the back. So if we set this up now, we know the front of our scene is pointing this way and the back of our scene is pointing this way, and we've got left and right. And it's just little things like that that I know I'm starting from the same point every single time. Now to actually save this, what we're going to do, and we're just going to bring this in a tiny bit. There we go. Go to defaults and save startup file. And now if I were to start a second instance of Blender, you'll see it's actually going to start me with this startup file, which is really nice. Again, it remembers everything in your scene. So one of the things you might want to do is set the menu over here just to be your dimensions and your frames and that kind of thing. So now if we save the startup file, where are we? Go to defaults, save startup file, and I had to click it twice. I was a little bit quick there. There we go. If we now open up Blender, before you can do anything, you can set your dimensions, you can set your render length, you can set your frame rate, and it looks like I set it to 50 by accident here. So let's actually turn that off. Let's set this to 30. And it just goes to show the amount of stuff that you could customize to make your life easier. And now when we start it up, we've got everything I want. There we go. It's set up perfectly the way I want. And now I can set my render settings and quickly start moving on. And all of the stuff that I want to be enabled is enabled, and I don't have to worry about it anymore. So that's sort of the reason for this. And throughout the course, this is kind of the UI you're going to be looking at. So with that said, let's move on to some preferences I change as well, just to make my life a little bit easier. That have to do sort of with the nature of my work, but also a couple of things that just make your life a little bit easier as well, hopefully. So let's move on to that.